Welcome! In this series of videos, we will look at software add-ons for the PowerBasic Windows compiler. Today we will look at using the My Little Grid custom grid and SQL Tools add-ons with SQL Server to speed up your application development. Today we're going to bring together several technologies for developing in PowerBasic, for which we have already covered some videos. First of all, we'll be using the PowerBasic Windows compiler. Additionally, we're going to be connecting to Microsoft SQL Server Express database. And we're going to be using My Little Grid, a custom grid control, to display our output. And finally, we're going to be using Perfect Sync's SQL Tools. This is to allow us to actually read and write to the SQL Server database from within PowerBasic. One of the challenges when doing software development is that you may not initially have a full requirement from the user who wishes an application created. Therefore, you may need to incrementally develop your application. These types of applications may well evolve over time. And to speed up your development work, it helps to have a quick and easy way to extend the functionality of your application with the least amount of work. You may indeed be working on several applications at the same time, and new requirements may emerge from discussions with the users. So what we're going to look at today is to use the PowerBasic Windows compiler, SQL Tools, SQL Server, and My Little Grid. And we're going to take some of the configuration logic out of the application and put it into SQL. Since it will sit within SQL as data, you can then amend the data in the database and change the functionality of your application. So what we have on screen here is Microsoft's SQL Server Express, the Management Studio. In here we're going to create our new database. And we'll just call this NLG Demo. And having created our database, we're going to put some SQL objects into it. I'll include the scripts for these SQL objects, but these are going to contain the configuration for the grids within our applications. This will support grids within many applications. So we have two scripts, a deploy SQL objects and a populate data. The deploy SQL objects will build the tables and the store procedures we actually need to hold this configuration information. And that's our objects created. We can now see that we have a number of tables created for our configuration definition. And in addition, we have some store procedures as well. I've prefixed the name of all these store procedures with cdef to indicate this is configuration definition. We're now going to populate the configuration tables with some data. And we now have some data pushed in. So we have a quick look at the data within these tables. We have the data in this table containing a list of all the applications which are configured within it. In this case, we have a cdef config.exe. This is the application written in PowerBasic using My Little Grid to hold the configuration for itself. And as we create more applications that require grids, we will use this cdef config.exe to create the configured information to define what shall appear on the grid. Having populated our configuration database, now we can have a look at our applications. I'll go into the details of the configuration application in a later video, but if we just try running this now, this will connect to the database we have just created. Now this gives you a choice of a number of search options. At the moment, the only application that is configured in this database is the cdef config application itself. And this application has a single form, and on that form is a single grid, and on that grid is a single tab. If we click the search on this now, it will give the details of the definition of this grid. Using this configuration grid, you can define how a grid will appear on a form, whether it has one tab or more than one tab, whether there is more than one grid on a particular form, and the grid position of each of the columns, how wide they are, whether they're visible or not, the colour of the data in the columns, whether the column is locked or unlocked, how it's justified, whether it contains a checkbox, and quite a few other options. We'll step through these in time. But we can quite easily see here there are two specific pieces of information which are key. There is the name of the column. This is the name that the users of your application will get to see on the column header. The result name column is the internal name of that column and how you will refer to it in code. Say for example you're pulling information back from a SQL Server database, this is what will be used. This way, if a user comes along later and says they don't like the name of a particular column, can they please call it something else, then you can quite easily nip into this configuration tool, change the name of the column that the user sees, and you don't have to touch the application at all. So there are no changes in code, it's purely in data. Also, if a user wishes an additional column added, you can add a new column quite happily, or you can hide an existing one. We'll cover this in more detail when we get into the PowerBasic code. Using this approach, it should be very easy to prototype an application for a user. That way you can get closer to your requirement much faster. But now let's have a look at the PowerBasic code. First of all, let me cover some of the technologies we're going to use. We'll be using Microsoft SQL Server Express. Now this is a free application which you can download from the Microsoft website. We'll also be using MyLittleGrid. Now MyLittleGrid is currently free, but I'll put a link in the description from where you can download it. We'll also be using SQL Tools from Perfect Sync. Now this is not a free application, but it's a very useful one and will save you a huge amount of time. I'll put a link in the description to where you can actually go on and purchase it. So I won't be able to actually distribute all the code for this application since the SQL Tools application is actually a purchased one. So having covered that, let's create our application. We're now going to create a simple form onto which we will put our grid. So if we go to the form designer and create a new dialog. We're going to center this one on the screen and we're going to maximize it. This form and basic program can be saved as a template on which you can use to build and demonstrate a prototype of all your applications to your users. So we'll just save this and we'll put it in here. Right, here's our basic application. Now PowerBasic's put a certain number of libraries in for you, but we're going to add some more. So we're including one constant here and a number of libraries. Now this is the library that comes with MyLittleGrid, and we're going to add in MyLittleGrid as a static linked library. Now we're going to add in a couple of extra constants which we'll use to control our definition of the grid, and we will include another library for generic utilities for MyLittleGrid. The next thing we're going to put in are some constants to control the limits of our grid definitions. What these constants will do is define the limits of our grid configuration. For example, each grid can contain up to a maximum of 50 columns. I set the maximum number of columns to 50 as this is a reasonable number and unlikely that you will need more than 50 columns on a grid. The maximum number of tabs is 5. At the moment, the maximum number of grids on each form is 1. You may well have occasions when you have a form which requires 2 grids, in which case just increase the number. The maximum number of forms I've set to 10. This is the maximum number of forms within this particular application. And the maximum number of rows is 6,000. Again, if you find these numbers too small, merely increase them. The final library to include, which I'll go through in detail in a later video, is the Form Grid tab Resource Library. This is the library that contains all the functions that allow us to manipulate the grids in real time. We will set another constant up to be the constant for our database, and we will set up one constant to define the handle for our first grid, and a global for that grid, and a global for the first sheet on that grid. Again, if we add additional grids, we'll need to duplicate these three. Although we won't be using these two global variables in this video, we will in future videos. The first is to allow you to sort the rows in a grid by a specific column, and the second one is a global to indicate to the application that the grid is currently being refreshed and not to make any updates. So having put all those in place, the next thing to do is to go into our PB main function, which of course is the first function we actually execute when the application starts. Now we need to do an initialization for my little grid, so we'll put that in here before we show the first form. And as this application is going to be reading from a small XML file, and the XML file will contain the name and the server on which your SQL Server database is sitting, we need to actually run a routine to populate our XML values from that. So this function will look for the XML values for this application and load them into memory. The next thing I'm doing is checking that I'm authorized to use the SQL Tools library, and I'm assuming that works fine. We're then going to initialize the library itself. So having got that out of the way, the next thing to do is to set up a connection string to connect to our SQL Server database, and these are using the variables which have been populated from the XML file, namely the database name and the server name. And having got that information, we can then call the routine to open the database. If we are unable to connect to that database, we'll then throw a message box out to the user and close down SQL and exit the application. There's one final thing we have to do before we show the first form to the user. The application that's actually running needs to have grid definitions. There's a function in our grid library which is going to pull that back for us quite nicely. We could put this in with a single line of code. The fun read app form grid definitions function has a single parameter, which is the name and extension of the application we're currently running, and if that returns a true, then it's quite safe to show our first grid. If this returns a false, it means we can find no grid definitions for this application. Right, now that we've sorted out the library problems, we've now got an application. Now, as we set no grid definitions up for this application, if we try running it now, it will come up with a message unable to get the configuration for this application. So what we'll have to do is do some configuration. So we're now in the Configure System Form Grids. All we need to do is click the Add button. Now we're going to add this new application, and as we called our application mlgdemo.exe, we'll put that in here as the name. All we need to do now is define the name of the form. Call this main form. We'll call the grid first grid, and we'll call the tab data. The tab field holds the name of the tab on the grid. This is what the user gets to see, so you can pick an appropriate name for the data you're going to be displaying. Now if we hit apply changes on that and come out of that screen, and if we exit our application here and run it once more, now we'll see we have two applications on the screen, our CDEF, which is the one we're in, and the MLG demo. We have one form, one grid, and one tab. If we hit the search button, we'll see it has indeed put 50 records in for the 50 possible columns. We can now go in here and put some columns in. We'll just call the first one ID and we'll untick the column hide. So before we run our application, what we'll want to do is to finalize some of our configuration information. The one thing we haven't put in yet is the tab position for this particular set of data. Now all of these are going to be in tab 1. So we'll just save that back to the database. So at the beginning of the form definition, we're going to put some variables in. Since there are going to be forms, grids and tabs on this screen, we set one variable up for each, and we've defined the name of the form, the name of the grid, and the name of the tab as they exist in the database. We've also included an additional variable for sorting, which we'll cover later. So how do we display that grid on our dialog? Well, we have a standard function which we can use to place the grid on our screen. The funPlaceGrid takes the dialog handle, the constant for the grid we're handling, we set those up earlier. It takes a sorting parameter, the handle of the grid, the form name, and the grid name. It doesn't at the moment need the tab name because there could be several tabs on that grid. And having done that, if we run our application now, so there's our grid appearing on screen with a single ID column, which is what we had set up. So let's put some more columns in. So let's add some additional columns. Now, having created these 4 additional columns, we're putting them into these grid positions. We'll make them all visible. We'll extend the size of these columns. And we will left justify the forename and surname. And we'll do the same for the job title as well, I think, and the department. And we will create an additional field called active. And this can be quite small, so we'll take that one down to 80, we'll make it visible, and we will mark it as a checkbox. And if we save all of that, if we exit the application and run the application again, we'll see that we now have more information. We have all the columns that we've set up. So we're now at the stage where we can actually prototype this to a user. We can tell them the information that's going to be shown on screen, and they can tell us what columns they want brought back. Now, if at a later point in time the user decides that they don't like the position of the department column and they want to swap it over with the job title column, we don't need to change any code in our application. All we need to do is to change the values in this grid definition. So the job title is currently in column 5 and the department in column 4. So all we need to do is to change those numbers round. And having saved that back to the system, we will see that the job title is now in column 4 and the department in column 5. And if we exit the application and run it again, the next time a user runs this application, the titles are swapped around without us having to change any code in the application at all. This gives you a very powerful tool for configuring your grids whenever the need arises. And if your code is set up correctly using the libraries here, which we'll demonstrate in the next video, you can actually change the grid definitions while people are actually using the application. And after you've saved them to the database, anybody who was running the application will still be running the way it was configured, because the application configuration is only loaded up when the application begins. Anybody running the application from then onwards will inherit the new configuration. One of the other options we can do is we can actually hide columns. Hide them from the user, but they will still be available in the grid for the code at the back end. For example, if we create a new field, we're going to create a new field which we don't want the user to see. And we will leave it as hidden. If we do that, then the column will actually be in the grid and available for the code in your application to do things with, so it could be a calculated field, but the user will never actually see that. So if we go back to our application, if we run it again, we will see there is no payroll column. The payroll column is in fact hidden. So what we've done today is we've used a SQL Server database to hold the configuration information for one of our My Little grids. We have used that to set up a single tabbed grid with named columns. The column name column holds the name of each of these columns, and this is not necessarily the same as it's referred to within the code. This allows you to change the name of a column so it does no longer match the result name, which is internal to the application and is be used with SQL Server. There are other options which we'll cover in a later video, but that's it for today. Thank you for watching.